It is a complex topic.
Yeah.
And it's one where I think a lot of the common assumptions people have about autism
Yeah.
get challenged when you really start digging into the research.
Yeah, and even just glancing at some of the things you sent over, it had a really surprising statistic, actually.
Right.
It makes you think about how we address this as a society, right? Like public awareness and support systems, all that.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
you know, that number itself is likely evolving as we understand the spectrum better.
That's true. I mean, one of the articles you sent over talked about how autism has been historically underdiagnosed, especially in females.
Right. And that's really starting to change as we learn more about the female autism phenotype. Girls may present differently, and that can lead to misinterpretations or misdiagnoses.
Makes you wonder how many people are out there living with undiagnosed autism simply because their presentation didn't fit the mold.
It's a really crucial point. And it really kind of gets to this fundamental aspect of autism that we have to understand right up front, the spectrum.
The spectrum, right, because we can't think about this as just like a one-size-fits-all condition, right?
Exactly. I mean, look at the materials you sent in. You've got cases of individuals with exceptional talents in things like math or music or art, but those same individuals might struggle immensely with social interaction.
Yeah, there was that case study you included, that young woman who was so gifted musically, but really struggled in social situations. It's like, it really highlights how diverse this presentation of autism can be.
It does. And, that diversity really gets to the heart of what we call neurodiversity. This idea that autism isn't a deficit. It's just a different way of experiencing the world.
So instead of trying to fit everyone into a single mold, we have to appreciate the variations within that spectrum.
Exactly. And, a major part of that unique experience has to do with sensory processing.
How profound the impact of sensory sensitivities can be for someone with autism.
It's really interesting, too, because it's often assumed that autistic individuals are just oversensitive to stimuli. But a lot of the research you sent highlights that. Hyposensitivity. Being under-responsive to sensory input is also a significant aspect of this.
Yeah, and I was looking at one of the papers you sent in, and it described it as like a neurological traffic jam.
A traffic jam.
Yeah, basically it's saying for some people with autism, the brain has trouble filtering and prioritizing sensory information, which can lead to either over or under responsiveness.
And think about how that would play out in daily life, right? Certain sounds might be unbearably loud, or maybe someone needs constant tactile stimulation.
Which actually explains those repetitive motions we often associate with autism, the stimming behaviors, right?
Exactly. So often we just see those behaviors as quirks, but when you think about it from a sensory processing perspective, it's a way of regulating sensory input.
So really just a way of trying to find a sense of calm or equilibrium in a world that might feel incredibly overwhelming.
It really makes you appreciate how much we take for granted in terms of how our brains just process sensory information without us even thinking about it.
Yeah. Myth about vaccines and autism.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, that myth persists.
It's frustrating, right? Because the science has completely debunked it over and over again.
Yeah. You actually sent over a study that looked at how this myth even originated and traced it back to a retracted paper based on flawed data and really unethical practices.
It just shows you how important critical thinking is, and relying on those credible sources of information, especially when you're talking about complex topics like this.
Especially when you're dealing with something like autism. And, while we're discussing those really crucial distinctions, I think we should also talk about those co-occurring conditions, the things that often show up alongside autism.
Yeah, you had quite a lot in that research packet on that. ADHD, anxiety disorders, even stuff like gastrointestinal issues, all being more common in autistic individuals.
Right, and it's not to say every single person with autism is going to experience these additional challenges, but the overlap is pretty significant.
And understanding that overlap helps us get a broader view of how complex this condition is.
Absolutely. It's you're piecing together this big puzzle, and you need all the pieces to really see that full picture.
Exactly. But, I'm kind of ready to move away from talking about the challenges for a minute, because all of the stuff you sent over was also full of amazing examples of autistic individuals just like achieving incredible things, defying limitations.
Absolutely. There's so much to celebrate.
It's true. So tell me what you thought was most interesting. What really jumped out at you?
Well, one of the studies really highlighted those remarkable spatial reasoning abilities, the ones that are often found in autistic individuals. and how they can lead to people excelling in fields like engineering or architecture, even computer programming.
Right. And then you have those who just have this incredible attention to detail, that hyper focus on their interests, which can lead to them becoming like true experts in their chosen area.
It's true, and it's not just about accumulating knowledge, it's about that deep dive. Becoming a master of that specific subject. I think
Yeah,
that's really pretty powerful.
I agree. It really challenges that deficit-based model of autism that we often see, right? And it highlights these unique cognitive strengths that can emerge and lead to such amazing
And
things.
imagine what's possible when we harness those strengths, right?
Mhm.
Think of the potential for innovation problem solving.
It's pretty exciting to think about. And you know what else is exciting? All of those initiatives that are popping up to help make the world more inclusive and accepting for people with autism.
I think it's encouraging to see that momentum building, these efforts to create sensory-friendly spaces, advocating for workplace accommodations. There's a lot happening.
It's amazing. There was that one company, they actually redesigned their entire office space to be more autism friendly, like reducing sensory overload, providing dedicated quiet spaces,
Yep.
using natural lighting.
It just goes to show that even those small changes can make a huge difference. It's about recognizing that need and taking those steps, no matter how small they seem. One thing that really stood out to me in all this material you sent was this concept of camouflaging. It's something a lot of autistic people do. But those outside the autistic community might not even realize it's happening.
Camouflaging. I'm not really familiar with that term, at least not in this context. What does that mean?
It's essentially masking or hiding autistic traits in social situations. Imagine constantly trying to fit in to
Yeah.
appear neurotypical, even though it's not really your natural way of being. It can be really exhausting.
Wow. I hadn't thought about it that way. So it's like for some autistic individuals, just navigating those everyday social interactions can feel like putting on a performance.
Exactly. And it's no wonder then that you see higher rates of mental health conditions, things like anxiety and depression among autistic individuals. Camouflaging can play a big role in that.
It makes sense, right? That's like carrying this invisible burden, this pressure to conform to social expectations that just don't align with your neurology.
Yeah. And one of the personal accounts you sent in, I think it was a blog post by an autistic woman, she described the toll that camouflaging took on her, those feelings of isolation, exhaustion.
It's a good reminder that what might seem effortless for one person can be a huge struggle for someone else. And it just underscores the need for greater understanding and acceptance of neurodiversity.
For sure. And I think that's why recognizing those signs of camouflaging can be so crucial in providing the right kind of support. And that kind of ties into another important aspect highlighted in all your research, those communication differences we see in autism.
You know, before I started digging into all the stuff you sent, I thought communication differences in autism were mostly about things like speech delays or being nonverbal. But it seems like it's much more nuanced than that, right?
Oh, yeah, it's way broader than that. It's about recognizing that. Communication styles can just be really diverse. Someone might be super articulate in writing, but find verbal communication really tough. Others might rely on alternative ways of communicating, things like sign language or assisted devices.
That section on augmentative and alternative communication, AAC, was really fascinating. It's amazing how technology is opening up new possibilities for communication and self-expression.
Absolutely. It's about finding those tools that work for each individual,
Right.
making sure they have a voice and can participate in society. You can't just take a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to communication.
For sure. And speaking of individual expression, one of the things that kept coming up in your research was this idea of special interests. Those deep-seated passions people with autism often have for a particular topic or activity.
Oh, yeah. And those special interests can be anything. I mean, they can be incredibly diverse. And they can really bring a lot of joy and focus to individuals with autism. One of the studies even suggested that these intense interests might be linked to the way autistic individuals process information, allowing them to hyper-focus on details and patterns that others might miss.
That's so cool. It's not just about knowing a lot about something. It's about that deep dive, that ability to become a true expert in that area. It's like a superpower, right? To be able to hyper focus and explore a subject with such passion.
I love that. It's a great way to think about it because it challenges that deficit-based model of autism that we talked about earlier, right? And highlights those unique cognitive strengths that are there.
Definitely. And I have to bring up this one section in one of your articles about autistic individuals and their relationship with animals. It was so heartwarming.
Oh, yeah. It talked about how so many autistic individuals find these deep connections with animals. And they experience a sense of calmness and understanding that they might not find in human interactions.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even research happening now about how animal-assisted therapy could really help people with autism.
Yeah, it makes sense to me because one of my good friends, her son is autistic and has this amazing bond with his therapy dog. I mean, it's really incredible to see.
It really speaks to that emotional depth, that capacity for connection that's there within autism. It's about finding those pathways to connection, whether it's through shared interests, animals, or other kinds of communication that we might not traditionally think about.
It challenges us to expand our ideas of what meaningful relationships can look like, that's for sure. But of course, we can't ignore that. Many autistic individuals also face really significant challenges, and one area that kept coming up was executive functioning.
Yeah. And that can be a really tough one because things like planning, organization, time management, stuff that a lot of people just do automatically can be incredibly difficult for some autistic people.
Why is that? Is it like a motivation thing, willpower?
Not at all. It's more about understanding that. Executive functioning relies on a lot of different cognitive skills working together, and autism can impact those skills.
There was one article that described it as like a disconnect between knowing what needs to be done and having the tools to actually do it, take those steps.
Right. And it's not about intelligence. It's just a different way of processing information, a different way of approaching those tasks, which is why having the right support and strategies in place can make such a big difference.
So instead of getting frustrated or being judgmental, we need to focus on providing those supports, right?
For sure. Things like visual aids, structured routines, breaking things down into smaller steps, these can all be super helpful.
It's about meeting people where they are and giving them what they need to succeed. And that actually leads to another important aspect of autism that I think often gets misunderstood, those sensory-seeking behaviors.
We talked about sensory sensitivities earlier, right?
Yeah.
This is like the flip side of that coin.
Exactly. It's not about avoiding sensory input. It's about seeking it out.
Think about things like rocking, spinning, hand flapping. These are those. Repetitive motions, sometimes called stimming. And for some autistic individuals, they can be really regulating.
So it's like trying to create that feeling of calm or balance through those sensory experiences.
And one study looked at the brain science behind this and suggested it might be linked to those. Endorphins or dopamine, those feel-good chemicals in our brains, right? So instead of seeing those behaviors as problematic or trying to stop them, we need to understand the underlying need that's being met.
That's a really helpful way to look at it. And it could lead to more effective strategies, right? Like instead of trying to eliminate stimming altogether, maybe we can provide alternative ways to meet those needs.
Exactly. And it really ties back to this whole theme of appreciating and respecting those different ways autistic people experience the world.
Yeah, it all comes back to that. And one thing I found really interesting was how much emphasis your research put on the unique learning styles we often see in autism.
It's a good reminder that those traditional educational models, they don't always work for every student. And that's especially true for many autistic learners.
There was a book you included that talked about visual thinkers and how many autistic individuals process information best through visual means, not just relying on auditory or verbal input.
So using visual aids, graphic organizers, hands-on activities, those can be game changers in supporting those learners.
It's about catering to their individual strengths and preferences, not trying to force them into a box that doesn't fit.
And, it's not just about the classroom either, right? This idea of inclusivity needs to extend into all areas of life, like the workplace.
Yeah, because the research shows that autistic adults face a lot of challenges when it comes to employment.
Absolutely. And it's not just about qualifications. It's about navigating all those unspoken social rules of the workplace, which can be incredibly difficult for some autistic individuals. Sometimes small changes can really make a big difference. And it's not just about the physical environment either. It's about clear communication guidelines, offering mentorship, educating colleagues about autism, just creating a more welcoming and supportive atmosphere overall.
It's about shifting our perspective
Right.
and seeing those strengths that autistic people bring to the table, those unique ways of thinking and solving problems. Those can be huge assets.
For sure. When we create workplaces that embrace those differences, everyone wins.
We're still learning about autism. It's not like a static thing,
Yeah, and it's really fascinating how much our understanding of autism has changed, even just in the past few years. Like, remember when Asperger's syndrome was considered a separate diagnosis?
You're right. It wasn't that long ago.
And now it's part of that broader ASD umbrella.
And one of your articles talked about how that shift really reflects a growing understanding of the diversity within autism, how it's not just this one monolithic thing.
Yeah, it's about moving away from those
Right.
rigid categories, embracing that fluidity of the spectrum. And you know that evolving understanding also applies to those diagnostic criteria themselves.
Yeah. One of the research studies you sent talked about how the criteria have become more inclusive over time, recognizing that autism can present so differently across genders, cultures, age groups. It's not just a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
And it makes you wonder how many people might have been
Yeah.
misdiagnosed because they didn't fit that traditional idea of what autism looks like.
It's a good reminder to stay open-minded, right? Knowledge is constantly evolving, and we have to adapt our perspectives as we learn more.
Absolutely. And speaking of evolving perspectives, one thing that kept coming up in these sources was how crucial early intervention is for autistic individuals.
Early intervention, right. And they really emphasized the early part of that, didn't they? Like,
Yeah.
the sooner the better.
For sure. And you sent over this book that really dug into the
Yeah.
neuroscience of it all,
Yeah.
explaining that early childhood is just such a crucial period for brain development. And so those interventions during that time can really make a huge difference.
It's not about fixing autism, though, is it? It's about giving kids those supports they need to learn and grow, to really reach their full potential.
Exactly. And when we're talking about early intervention, it can look so different for every individual. It really depends on what that specific child needs.
Mm.
But a lot of your sources highlighted therapies like ABA, applied behavior analysis, which focuses on teaching new skills and helping to reduce some of those challenging behaviors that might be there.
Right, and there's speech therapy to address communication challenges, occupational therapy to help with sensory processing and motor skills. It's like a whole team effort.
It is, and it really takes everyone working together to create that support system. Therapists, educators, families, everyone's got a role to play.
There was one article that talked about the importance of parent training programs,
Sure.
giving those parents the knowledge and skills they need to best support their autistic child. It makes sense, right?
Absolutely. It's that whole idea of empowering families to be those best advocates for their kids. But we can't forget that support doesn't stop when someone turns 18,
Yeah.
Adults with autism face their own unique set of challenges.
That's where that idea of lifelong support comes in, because transitioning into adulthood is tough for everyone, but it can be especially difficult when you're navigating it with autism.
For sure. And, you included this one personal essay. It was written by an autistic adult, and they were reflecting on all those challenges they faced after finishing school. The lack of support for adults, the difficulty finding a job, that social isolation they felt. It was really powerful.
It's a reminder that the need for understanding and acceptance doesn't just disappear overnight.
Right. We need to be thinking about those supports for autistic adults, too. Things like vocational training programs, supported living arrangements, social skills groups. There are so many areas where we can do better.
And, it's not just about putting those programs in place. It's also about making sure healthcare professionals are getting the right training on autism, and not just when they're first starting out, throughout their entire careers.
That's such a good point. Because it's not just about being able to diagnose autism, it's about really understanding the challenges those individuals might face throughout their lives.
It's about those healthcare providers
Right.
being able to give sensitive and informed care, recognizing and addressing co-occurring conditions, connecting people to the resources they need. It's a lot.
It is. And it all comes down to
Lot.
creating those partnerships between healthcare professionals and autistic individuals, recognizing that. Those individuals are the experts in their own experiences.
That's so important. And it's not just about the professionals either, is it? It's about creating a world where people with autism feel truly included and accepted.
That's where we all come in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how can we as individuals actually help make that happen? What can we do?
I think it all starts with educating ourselves. The more we learn about autism, the better we're able to challenge our own assumptions. The better we're able to advocate for those who experience the world differently. We can create those inclusive environments.
Absolutely. And that means challenging those stereotypes you see out there, speaking up against misinformation, being an ally to those autistic individuals in your life. And remember that understanding is a journey. It's not something you just arrive at. There's always more to learn.
And these sources that you sent over, these are a fantastic place to start. I mean, they've definitely opened my eyes to so many things I hadn't even considered before. And I really hope everyone listening takes the time to explore them, too.
It's not about looking at autism as something to be cured. It's about seeing it as a different way of being, a different way of experiencing the world.
And recognizing that, within that difference, there's so much potential. Strength, creativity, unique ways of seeing things. It enriches us all.
It's about embracing that neurodiversity, celebrating the fact that our brains work in all these different ways. And autism is a part of that. And it's up to all of us to build a world where every single person feels valued and appreciated for who they are.
We've been on quite a journey in this deep dive, and I really hope this conversation has made people think about things in new ways, sparked their curiosity to go out and learn more. Because understanding is where it all begins.
It really is. So as you continue learning about autism, keep asking those questions, keep challenging yourself, keep advocating for a better world for autistic individuals.
Thank you to everyone listening for joining us today for this deep dive into autism spectrum disorder. Keep learning, keep sharing what you learn, and let's build a world where everyone can thrive.